You would not have gone, however, said Elinor, recovering herself, without receiving our good wishes, even if we had not been able to give them in person. Mrs. Jennings was quite right in what she said. I am charged with a most agreeable office. Colonel Brandon, who was here only 10 minutes ago, has desired me to say that, understanding you mean to take orders, he has great pleasure in offering you the living of Delaford, now just vacant, and only wishes it were more valuable. Allow me to congratulate you on having so respectable and well-judging a friend, and to join in his wish that the living, it is about 200 a year, were much more considerable. Edward looked, all the astonishment which such unexpected information could not fail in exciting, but he said only these 2 words. Colonel Brandon? Yes, continued Elinor. Colonel Brandon means it as a testimony of his concern for what has lately passed. When Mrs. Jennings came home, her mind was so occupied by the important secret in her possession that she reverted to it again as soon as Elinor appeared. "Well, my dear," she cried, "I sent you up the young man. You did not find him very unwilling to accept your proposal?" "No, ma'am, that was not very likely." "Well, and how soon will he be ready?" "I suppose 2 or 3 months will complete his ordination." 2 or 3 months! cried Mrs. Jennings. "Can the Colonel wait 2 or 3 months? Lord bless me! Though one would be very glad to do a kindness by poor Mr. Ferrars, I do not think it is worth while to wait 2 or 3 months for him. Sure, somebody else must be found that would do as well. Somebody that is in orders already." "My dear ma'am," said Elinor, "what can you be thinking of? Why, Colonel Brandon's only object is to be of use to Mr. Ferrars." "Lord bless you, my dear! Sure, you do not mean to persuade me that the Colonel only marries you for the sake of giving 10 guineas to Mr. Ferrars?" The deception could not continue after this, and an explanation immediately took place, by which both gained considerable amusement for the moment, without any material loss of happiness to either. Edward, having carried his thanks to Colonel Brandon, proceeded with his happiness to Lucy, and such was the excess of it by the time he reached Bartlett's building that she was able to assure Mrs. Jennings, who called on her the next day with her congratulations, that she had never seen him in such spirits before in her life. It was now above a week since John Dashwood had called in Berkeley Street, and as since that time no notice had been taken by them of his wife's indisposition, beyond one verbal inquiry, Elinor began to feel it necessary to pay her a visit. Marianne, not contented with absolutely refusing to go herself, was very urgent to prevent her sister's going at all, and Mrs. Jennings so very much disliked Mrs. John Dashwood that she could not overcome her unwillingness to be in her company again. The consequence was that Elinor set out by herself to pay a visit. John Dashwood expressed great pleasure in greeting Elinor and, assuring her that Fanny would be very glad to see her, invited her to come in. They walked upstairs into the drawing-room. Nobody was there. "Fanny is in her room, I suppose," said he. "Why would not Marianne come?" Elinor made what excuse she could for her. "I am not sorry to see you alone," he replied, "for I have a good deal to say to you. This living of Colonel Brandon's, can it be true? Has he really given it to Edward?" "It is perfectly true." "Really? Well, this is very astonishing. No relationship, no connection between them. What could be the Colonel's motive?" "A very simple one. To be of use to Mr. Ferrars." "Well, well, whatever Colonel Brandon may be, Edward is a very lucky man. You will not mention the matter to Fanny. Mrs. Ferrars knows nothing about it at present, and I believe it will be best to keep it entirely concealed from her as long as may be." "But why should such precaution be used? She has done with her son. She has cast him off for ever." "Ah, Elinor," said John, "your reasoning is very good, but it is founded on ignorance of human nature. Mrs. Ferrars can never forget that Edward is her son." "You surprise me. I should think it must nearly have escaped her memory by this time." "You wrong her exceedingly. Mrs. Ferrars is one of the most affectionate mothers in the world." Elinor was silent, and John was also for a short time silent. His reflections ended thus. "Of one thing, my dear sister," taking her hand, "I may assure you. Indeed, I have it from the best authority, that in short, whatever objections there might be against a certain connection, you understand me, it would have been far preferable to her. It would not have given her half the vexation that this does." Elinor had heard enough. If not to gratify her vanity, and raise her self-importance, to agitate her nerves and fill her mind, and she was therefore glad to be spared from the necessity of saying much in reply herself, by the entrance of Mr. Robert Ferrars. After a few moments' chat, John Dashwood, recollecting that Fanny was yet uninformed of her sister's being there, quitted the room in quest of her, and Elinor was left to improve her acquaintance with Robert. They had scarcely been 2 minutes by themselves before he began to speak of Edward, for he too had heard of the living, and was very inquisitive on the subject. Elinor repeated the particulars of it as she had given them to John, and their effect on Robert, though very different, was not less striking than it had been on him. He laughed most immoderately. The idea of Edward's being a clergyman and living in a small parsonage house diverted him beyond measure.